quite a bit of time last week looking at the fact that there is no formal name given for the church. There never has been, and that the designations that are found today or that are known today are, I hate to say they're man-made. They do come from Scripture, but they are simply identifications that have been converted into names. And I think I made mention at the very end of the class that when Alexander Campbell was involved in his part of restoring New Testament Christianity in the Ohio Valley, with Pennsylvania and Ohio, his group, I think, was called the Churches of Christ. And then Barton Stone was in Kentucky doing the same type of work, again going back to the Bible and getting rid of all denominational ties and creed books and whatnot. And I believe his group was called they called themselves the Disciples of Christ. And then there was even another group, I think, that referred to themselves as the Christian Church. And but Stone and Campbell met I believe it was in the early 1830s. In their work, again, they had never met. They were not working in conjunction with one another, but they were doing and practicing and teaching the exact same thing. And in that meeting, there was no real discussion with regard to what are we going to call ourselves. That was just not something that they were concerned with. But eventually there came to be somewhat of a consensus, and the moniker of the name Church of Christ was adopted and stuck. But again, that just comes from Romans 16 and verse 16, and in that case, it's not used as a name. It's just simply used as an identifying a particular group of people. And so we've been talking about the name and whatnot. And now I want us to go to page 35, and this is important for us to note. And I'm glad Stroop spent some time with it because he came down pretty hard on the matter of the church not having a name. But at the first he didn't elaborate. I wish he would elaborate a little bit earlier, but he didn't elaborate here about a little over halfway down on the right-hand side of 35, it says, there was no, and here it is, says, there was no need, this talking about in the first century, there was no need for special designation for any church to distinguish itself from other churches, so it was only necessary to indicate that they were God's churches or made up God's church or assembly. I thought this was an interesting statement. And then let me encourage you to open your Bibles to the book of Acts, and we'll start in chapter 9, and we'll look at verse 2. Then we'll move to Acts 19 and look at verses 9 and 23. And then we'll look at Acts 22 and go to verse 4. And then lastly, we'll look at Acts 28 and verse 22. But Acts 9 and verse 2 is where we want to begin reading from the text and noting what Stroop says here. Says, there was no need for any identifying or special designation or any way to distinguish one group from another. Now look in verse 2 in chapter 9, and what designation do we find for the church in Acts 9 and verse 2? The way. No, it didn't say the church. It doesn't say the disciples. It's identified as the way. Paul, or at that time still Saul of Tarsus, was headed to Damascus to find those who were of the way, whether men or women, and bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now, when he's talking about the way, what's he talking about? Talking about Christianity. People that were Christians, that were practicing New Testament the New Testament doctrine pertaining to the assembly or the church. Now look over in chapter 19 and verse number 9. Paul's at Ephesus, and it says that in verse number 9, in verse 8, he was in the synagogue preaching for 3 months. It says, but when some were hardened and did not believe, but spoke what? Evil of the way. The way. Once again, the designation, the way. The meaning what? 2 things. The means 2 different things. 2 things. Number 1, specific. Number 2, singular. There was a specific way, and there was only one of them. The way. Now look in the same chapter down to verse number 23. It says, about that time there arose a great commotion about what? The way. And by the way, when Luke is writing this, he's writing it to Theophilus, and he assumes that Theophilus knows exactly what he's talking about when he uses the term the way in Acts 9, twice in 19, now over in 22 and verse 4. Paul's giving a defense, and he's giving a little bit of history about himself. What does he say in verse number 4? He said, I persecuted what? This way. This way. Again, this meaning a specific one, and it is singular. And so we find this concept or this identification of the church as the way. It kind of reminds me of the passage in Isaiah. There will be a highway and a way, the highway of holiness. And so to me, every time I read the way in Acts, it kind of takes me back to Isaiah's prophecy that there was going to be a way, a singular way, whereby man might attain holiness. Now, lastly, this is going to be a different terminology, but look in verse number 22 of Acts 28. Acts 28, verse 22. How is the church identified in this case? Sect, S-E-C-T, sect, generally means a group within a group. Or, for example, there are a number of sects of Islam. There are the Sunnis and there are the Shias. In other words, those are groups within a broad group. And what we learn from this particular statement is that in the eyes of many in the first century, now it's not accurate, but what it teaches us is that many people thought that Christianity was a sect of Judaism or an outgrowth of Judaism. But again, they are identified as a specific group of people. By the way, the word there for sect is the same word for heresy. In other words, the word heresy doesn't. So we understand the word heresy doesn't necessarily carry a negative connotation. It can be neutral. We can say.
I was just wondering. I'd read that before, but I didn't think of it in that way. I often wonder now, I wonder if he was talking about the group as a whole, or if when he says sect, if he was talking about the perpetrators of it, like as in the disciples themselves, and not the offspring.
I don't know. I would think just because of the way of the Jewish mindset, there are already a number of sects within Judaism. There was the Pharisees, there were the Sadducees, there were the Essenes, There were
That's why I thought maybe that it might have been the apostles.
I don't.
Disciples, the apostles.
They would probably have been associated with the apostles, but those that followed them would have been considered a part of the group, because it says that they are everywhere spoken against, and that leads me to believe it's the group and not the leaders, because the apostles didn't, for the most part, early on, did not leave Jerusalem, but the early church left Jerusalem and went everywhere preaching the word. So, with the Jews already being minded that, hey, there are groups within there are groups within Judaism, then there were Herodians, there were just Idumeans, there were a number of groups within the Jewish umbrella, and I would say that in the mind of the Jews, they were just thinking, well, here's just one more. Here's just one more. But the point is that the church was identifiable. Even if somebody had the wrong idea about what it was still identifiable by any number of identifying marks.
They're thinking in this is that this group is trying to change Judaism or be a total separate entity.
Both.
You see where I'm going?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Both. All right. Now, all right. Let's get back to the specific identifying of the church. The way, that way, this way. Singular. Question: is there still only one way? Yes. So, and the reason I ask that is there was only one way in the days of the first century. Because that was the way. Now, just because men have decided that there's more than one way doesn't mean that there's more than one way. Just because men have convinced themselves that there are numerous ways or even ways within the way does not make it so. There's still just one way. And this is going to some of this is going to carry over into the sermon. I don't want to give too much of it away, but what we need to understand is that God expects His church to be identifiable, distinguished or distinct from not only from the world, but from religion in the world. And for us today, God would expect His church to be distinct from all other religious entities that claim to be Christianity. In other words, there is a pattern. There are things that we can look for whereby the church can be identified. And so I think that's important for us to bear in mind, especially as we look this morning. The sermon is on Bible authority, the matter of Bible authority. And one of the things that we'll discuss is that God authorizes through patterns. In other words, God expected things to be identified by patterns, whether it be the priesthood or the tabernacle or the temple or any other number of things, the ark. There are any other number of things that could be mentioned. But God gives patterns whereby things can be easily or readily identified. And the same goes for the church. The church is likened unto a pattern. And I'm going to get off of that because that's like the last point of my sermon this morning. And so, but there are patterns that God expects us to be able to see, to identify, in this case, the church or the assembly. Now, note, picking up from where I just left off, where it says that made up God's church or assembly. Note, when religious people began to press their own interpretation of God's teaching to the extent that they refused to work with others and wanted to propagate their own peculiar doctrine, then they were in need of a name to represent them.
That's the truest statement.
Man, you'll never read a more true statement than that. When people decided that they wanted to teach, that's right. When people decided they wanted to teach what they wanted to teach, and in so doing were refusing to work with others, then they needed some way to identify themselves from the rest of the people. And I love the phrase, the phraseology. They wanted to press their doctrines in such a way as to refuse to work with others. And when that came to be a reality, those people needed a name. They needed a name. And by the way, in many cases, when people did that, whatever that group was ended up, they didn't have their own name. They ended up with a name that somebody hung on them. And we'll talk about that in just a few moments. But when people decide they don't want to follow the Bible and it alone, and they want to follow the doctrines and creeds of man to the exclusion of working with others, then they need a name to represent them. In other words, each name or each church name has become a sort of brand or trademark for a particular kind of religion, or one having its own characteristic emphasis. All right. Now, at the bottom of 35 and into 36, he makes a note that some have made name adjustments. It says through, they've individually adapted, motivated either by the desire to conform more closely to the Bible teaching than other churches of the community, or to secure for themselves greater religious freedom than that which was offered by other churches. Now, I want to spend a second on that latter part. Some churches change their name because their identification with another group limits them in what they believe they can say or do. I'll give you an example. One of the largest churches in Tupelo, Mississippi is identified as the Orchard. The Orchard. You may have seen their place. It's really, really nice. I don't know how many services they have in any given week, but they claim, and I don't have any reason based upon what I've seen from their physical facilities to doubt it, but they claim that they have about 2,500 worshipers a week. Now, I don't know if that means they have two services that have 1,250 each on a Sunday, or if they mean that they have a Sunday and a Sunday night and a Wednesday night, and the total of that number is 2,500. But whatever it is, it's a significant number of people. Well, it might surprise some of you if you've seen that place to know that the Orchard is a Methodist church. It's a Methodist church. And in fact, in the last year or so, they've severed their ties with the United Methodist Church. Now, the reason they did that is because of the Methodist Church, primarily the homosexual problem that they're dealing with right now. All right? But and by the way, the Louisville, Mississippi United Methodist Church voted to leave the United Methodist organization. Now they're just simply called the First Methodist Church of Louisville. And they voted 175-6 to leave the United Methodist organization. And the Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, which is one of the largest Methodist churches anywhere, has voted to leave. And so they voted to leave because, and they changed their name because they found that being associated with the Methodist Church was not conducive to their success or what they wanted to do. And so you'll find that churches are changing their name to allow themselves more freedom to do what they want to do aside from denominational type. By the way, a couple, 3 years ago, the older I get, the more I think that something that happened last year was actually 6 years ago. And so I'm going to go out on a limb and say it was 2 or 3 years ago, but it still could have been 5. All right. There was a revival at one of the denominational churches in Hamilton. One of the hometown boys came back to hold a revival in Hamilton. And I don't remember who he's related. He's related to some well-known family in Hamilton. They had a big revival. And it was at one of the Baptist churches in town. I think First Baptist, if I'm not mistaken. Well, he preaches for a church, I think in Jackson, Mississippi. It's a Baptist church. But guess what? It doesn't have its name. Baptist. That's correct. And he even said it when the newspaper interviewed him, that having that name on the church was constricting for us. It was a barrier. And so, and I don't know what they decided to call themselves, but whatever it is, the point was they changed their name. They changed their name to allow themselves more freedom to do the things that they want to do. By the way, let me ask you a question. What is a community church? Yeah, what is it? What is it? Because I know there's one in Hackleburg. I know there's one in Hamilton out on the Sod Farm Road. Yeah, but what does that mean? Say it, Kyle.
It's just a group of people who got together to do things how they want to do it.
There's a group of people that's got together and they do things the way they want to do it. That's what it is. Because just because there's a community church in Hackleburg and there's a community church in Hamilton, there's a community church in Russellville or Jasper, doesn't mean they all may call themselves community church, but that doesn't mean anything, does it? What they believe and teach may or may not be even remotely akin to one another, right? And so, but what have we done? We've given ourselves a name, but the name allows us basically to do whatever we want to do. And you can call yourself by that name in another town, and what you do may not have anything to do with what we're doing. One group may jump up, may jump benches and shout and holler and wave their hands, and the other group may not be anything like that, but they both have a community church. But in other words, the name allows them to do what they want to do. And so we're finding more and more, and I'll get to this when we get to the bottom of 36. We're finding more and more that people, I think there's some ways in which people are trying to get back to more biblical names and away from denominational monikers. But changing your name really doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything. Now, note underneath from that next paragraph, it says, many of those of the former class, in other words, there are groups that are named based on not on Bible things, but on founders or methodologies or practices. It says, many of those of the former class, this group, have sought to give evidence of their zeal. Move down. While others have used a modification of some Bible term that in part characterizes their form of church organization or government or their characteristic religious procedure, while others have accepted the name of some outstanding religious leader. Now let's look through this list. What group is named? What group can you think of that is called by its church organization? This one may. Now, when I tell you, you're gonna like, oh yeah. But the reason you're not going to think of it because there aren't any around here that I can think of. Presbyterian. The Presbyterian church is called such because they have elders in their churches. They have presbyters. That's a Bible term for the eldership. And so their name reflects their church organization. That was the only one I could really think of. What about a church that is named after its particular religious procedure? Seventh-day Adventists. Because what? They meet on Saturday. So their name reflects their procedure. What's another one? What's another one? That reflects something that they do. Any of them, any Baptist, is based on the practice of immersion. Now, by the way, that is not a name that they chose for themselves. That is a name that was hung on them back at the very beginning of their existence, when they were called Anabaptists. Ana meaning again, because they left Catholicism and those associated religions and began to practice the biblical teaching of immersion. And so what you had was a bunch of people who had been sprinkled as infants, leaving that and practicing what the Bible teaches in regard to the form, which is immersion. And so their detractors called them Anabaptists. In other words, twice baptized. And so that was a name that was actually stuck on them by people who didn't agree with them, and it's a name that stayed. By the way, John Wesley and Charles Wesley did not adopt the name Methodist. In fact, there were a number of names that were stuck on them by the Anglicans. But the Wesleys adopted Methodist, and here was the reason. He said, because at least the name Methodist identified something that could be seen. In other words, we do things differently. In other words, we follow a method. We follow a structured concept. And so it was a name actually given to them by their enemies. But they accepted it because it meant something. At least, hey, people have identified us as that we do something different. We have a method. There's a methodology. And so you have that. What about a church that's named after a particular religious leader? Lutherans. And by the way, Martin Luther hated the idea that his people were called Lutherans. He hated it. He wrote about it. And he said, may the name Lutheran perish. You know what he wanted those people to be called? Christians. That was his wish. That the name Lutheran perish and be banished forever, and that the people that followed what he was doing be simply called Christians. And so we see, and by the way, there are others, but those are the ones that are probably most well known to us. But note in the next paragraph or the next line, he says these doctrinal names have undergone so many modifications that the names have virtually lost their significance. In other words, there might be 25 different kinds of this name and 10 different kinds of this name. And so the name really doesn't identify you at all because of the within that group there's so much fracturing and splintering of these groups. And here's what it says. And the process of adaptation of church doctrine under the influence of individual desires continues. Now, the last thing he mentions here is in this last paragraph, and I think this is a really, really good thing to think about. He says, the irony of the whole situation lies in the fact that this motley array of names, which probably stands as the most universal monument to human pride and conceitedness to be found in the entire world, has been erected and is being maintained by the people whose redeeming characteristic must be humility. In other words, the fact that there are so many religious groups is not a testimony to humility. It's a testimony to pride. He said, what irony is it that God's people are to be marked by humility, and yet pride is found in the masses of religious bodies and the mass of religious division that's present in the world today. And then the next line, here it is. It is a picture of rugged individualism rather than that of a submissive people. They've been guided by their own desires instead of the wisdom of the God whom they claim to serve. They are walking in the ways of men instead of becoming imitators of the Christ whom they claim to love. But that phrase, rugged individualism, back probably, 30 years ago, about 30 years ago when I had first started listening to talk radio and I listened to Rush Limbaugh, that was a phrase that he used a lot, rugged individualism. But he used it in a favorable way to describe the American way. In other words, if you're an American, America was built on rugged individualism. Lewis and Clark, Daniel Boone, all these guys, that and all the people, by the way, and everybody that moved west in the gold rush was all an example of rugged individualism.
That's more along the lines of perseverance. This is more of a wokeness, is it not?
Well, yes, some, but the point is that as Americans, we value rugged individualism. We value the guy that, one of my favorite economists and writers is a guy named Thomas Sowell. Grew up in Harlem in the 1940s. And he grew up during a time when blacks were not equally accepted in the communities as whites were. And yet he went on to he has his doctorate in economics. I mean, the man's absolutely brilliant. And, for lack of a better, and I don't think he'd call his story rags to riches, but in other words, he didn't enjoy any privileges. And he worked his way up, and he worked hard and he succeeded. Or a guy like Herman Cain, and he Godfather's Pizza. A guy that comes up and through his own hard work and his perseverance, his desire to succeed, he makes it. All right, rugged individualism is what makes America great. All right, but rugged individualism has destroyed Christianity. In other words, rugged individualism is a good thing in its proper place. In its proper place, it's a good thing. The problem is that a lot of times we have a hard time separating this mindset that we all believe is a good one when it gets into religious matters. But the truth of the matter is, they are not mutually exclusive. You can be a rugged individualist and still be a faithful member of the body of Christ. Insofar as one recognizes that in spiritual matters, Christ has all the say. I'm free to go out and start a business. I'm free to go out and clear land and start farming it, or whatever guys did back in the 1800s and 1900s, and I'm free to make my own way, and that's a good thing. But for lack of a better term, just as an illustration, but when I step through those doors, Christ has the say, and rugged individualism's got to go out the door or stay outside. And so there's a lot of ways in which the things which made our nation great have actually destroyed us in matters pertaining to spiritual things.
It's dependent when you've been successful, you depend on yourself.
That's exactly right, Lynn. When we learn to depend on ourselves in matter and obviously, look, all of us understand, that whenever we're successful or even when we're not, we still have God. That God has helped us. But what Lynn said is right. Is that we get this mindset that I'm going to work hard and I'm going to succeed, and this is going to pay off, and I'm going to make my own decisions and I'm going to live with them. They're good or bad. But the problem is, if we carry that mindset over into spiritual things, then Christ gets pushed to the side. And what I want becomes God. And in a sense, I become my own God.
You bounce all that celebrating into basically a lot of these people, they didn't have a plan coming in. Like they didn't have a set plan, they had figured out. In the church, God gives you a plan, God gives you a way.
Right.
So you have it. So you don't have to rely on just yourself.
That's right.
Rely on the church and on the Lord.
Not only do you not have to, you shouldn't.
Right.
Yeah, God gives you the plan. That's exactly right. And other guys are forging their own way, just kind of as they're going along, whatever comes, I'm going to handle it. Whereas that's exactly right, Colby, is that God's given us the plan. We just have to submit. We just have to submit ourselves to that plan. I like that thought. I like that thought a lot. All right, any other thoughts? Any other thoughts along these lines? We'll stop there so we can start fresh on the idea of the building next week. Anything else? All right, if not, we'll stop there. We'll start at the top of page 37 next week.